you very much. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I
Me
feel
too?
like we're missing something. We're missing the bearskin rug. maybe.
Yeah.
So before I begin, I want to tell a little story, and Rich's keynote reminded me. Of the time that the master macrologist Pai Mu was invited to a panel at the Little Languages Workshop. And typically, Pai Mu stays on the mountain. He doesn't want to come down. And but in this event, he decided to, and he came down and he sat on the panel. It's one of those things where you have these big minds talking about their languages, and I did this, and I did this, and how should we do this, and how should we do that? And he sat silent the whole time, just fanning himself. And it got to the point where people started noticing that he wasn't saying anything, so an audience member said, Pai Mu, what do you think about programming language development? And he sat and he fanned himself. And he kept doing this to the point where it started to become a little uncomfortable. And then just before someone was about to speak up, he said, everyone does have a programming language inside of them. And in most cases, that's where it should stay. And he stood up, hit the microphone with his fan and walked out. And everyone was enlightened.
So this is a conch talk, and I've been bad at this at my previous one, so I thought I would include a dictionary definition. I'm not sure I'm doing it right. You can't say I didn't warn you, but this is real. It's not why I go by that name, but you know, I looked yours up as well, but I don't know how to do this part.
I am an enigma. So, speaking of programming language development, on about 2005, there was a programmer with a background in C++ and Java who was dissatisfied with the landscape of programming languages, dissatisfied with his experience. And so he decided to take some time and, see if he could do something a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And the language that he thought of was a functional language, scheme-like in nature, somewhat interesting syntax, I'd say, hosted on the JVM, a richer set of data structures that you might find in something like a scheme, lists, of course, but maps, and integrated production rules and units of measure.
What?
Yeah. Yeah,
what do we have?
It was a language called Ix. Oh. And it was created by this guy. So my first introduction to Clojure was in actually trying to make my own programming language. And the fate of that programming language, I'll leave that for a little bit later. But as you can see, there are no Ix conferences happening right now. But really, we wanted to talk about a language by this guy.
Yeah. So we're going to go back to 2005, which is more than 10 years ago. But this is when when the first commit in the current set of repos is there. And the initial ones were in CVS. So take yourself back to a time when we checked code into CVS and created projects on SourceForge. And that's where Clojure got started. So lines of code, a little hard to know how to take these into account, but just we'll look at a couple more numbers in a bit. But the peak right before it was released was the 21,000 lines of code, about half Java and half C#. And then just before release, the C# went away. So it's interesting that originally the C# runtime was targeted equally. The first actual release and announcement came out. The code was in a zip file, and it had 12,000 lines of code. And before today, that would end up growing by 3 times. The Clojure code was 582 lines. So a handful, right? and that grows 50 times by today. And 129 vars. Of course, they weren't vars yet, because vars go in namespaces, and there weren't namespaces yet. But there were 129 symbols. So if you wanted to learn the entire language, that's how many you had to know when it first came out. This is a commit from exactly 10 years ago today. I don't know how well you can see all that, but the commit message is swapping colon T, so keyword T, for the letter T. And in the smaller print there, you can see that until this point, there was a global variable named lowercase t that was assigned a value out of the Java interop layer. And at this moment, it was removed and replaced with the convention of using a keyword. I think this is interesting. Yesterday, there was a talk by Ariel Ortiz where he was looking at the original Lisp implementation by McCarthy, and this was one of the things that he had to call out, was that there's this convention of using symbol T. And so this is one of the steps where Clojure is starting to take a slightly different path on some of these details. No booleans yet. There's still no support in Clojure for booleans at this point, just the convention of using truthy and non-truthy things. Also words that probably weren't used.
Not yet.
Not yet. This was also the same day that the function zipmap was added, that does the pairwise building of a map. So that was 10 years ago today, what Clojure looked like. So in this era, before 1.0, it was allowable, reasonable, to rename functions. So I thought it'd be fun to list some of the old names of functions and see if anybody could guess what names they become. So one of the names.
Yell it out.
Yeah, let it out. Yeah, go ahead. So Curry?
Partial?
Great guess. No. But hang on to that. We'll see.
It's the only one.
That's the only one here. Yes.
Okay.
That's fine.
So this release is kind of interesting because this is just a month later, and this is I didn't distinctly remember this. I had to go back and look at my blog, but this is the first release of Clojure that I got and checked out because going back, this is really starting to become a language that we can recognize, right? It has things like range. Multi-methods were in there. And because I was creating my own language at the time, I was exploring the landscape. And at the time, I don't recall a lot of languages on the JVM, but I distinctly remember JScheme. I think that was Peter Norvig's implementation. There was Armed Bear. I think even Armed Bear was back then. And a couple more, but
That's a common Lisp, right?
that's right. That's common
Armed
Lisp.
Bear.
And I think even then, back then, it was a very low dot number, 0.01 or
I see.
something like that. And so, well, in creating my own language, I wanted to go and look and see how people handled big numbers.
Okay.
And so that's how I came across Clojure. And on the date 10/24, I created a little blog post, my own little notes, and that's the first time that the word Clojure appears on my own
Your
blog.
That's cool. I don't think I knew about Clojure yet at this point. I think it was a little later that I stumbled onto it.
I'm sure that I downloaded it and then forgot about it for a little while. I download a lot of things.
So the language is growing, as is Rich's hair. So I don't know. Speaking of growing, I don't know, we couldn't figure out exactly when to fit this in, but we wanted to mention that it was great that Guy Steele gave a talk last night, and one of my favorite tech conference talks of all time was his growing a language. So the title of our talk is a little homage to that. He had a lot more to do with that talk than we had to do with this language, so we're just watching, but
Yes.
that's fun. Okay, so 2008, we have some more renames.
This is where we can have a little bit of fun.
Yeah. Any guesses as to what Bang is now called? Good, good. What about select? Select keys, yeah. So sort of set. This is almost unfair. Some of these things are not the final names, obviously.
Yeah.
To set, maybe it's closer to what you're thinking. Scan. Yeah, that's good. Some, no, I don't think so.
This is my favorite. I like this one.
Touch.
Touch, yeah.
Touch. Surely. No? See? A little unification in the names there. We're getting good ones. NS exports, not too shocking. Okay, this one we got, right? Not equal, yeah. Contains, the controversy begins.
Adding the question mark didn't
fix it.
Solve the problem.
Okay, people were guessing this one before. Apple did eventually become partial. And of course, we finally get some Booleans in there. And these are all, like I said this before, these are all before 1.0, so it's okay to make breaking changes, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So in 2008 that's about the time that I really started exploring Clojure. I had downloaded it and run it and found some good things in the source code, and so I was really curious about trying it out. But at the time, I had worked in a secure facility, and so to bring things into this secure facility was a major pain. And so what I did is I had to fill out a little form and write down all the libraries.
Paper form.
Yeah, paper form. And write down the libraries that I wanted to bring into this secure facility. And one of the things that I wrote down was clojure.jar. And so my thinking at the time was, we can use this for testing. And so its integration with Java and the ability to call it to Java libraries, I thought, look, this is probably a good way to leverage this thing. And so I brought it in. I managed to fill out the form, and this is not exactly the Ant task that we had used at the time, and that stuff is now under lock and key somewhere. But this is in the spirit of what we were trying to do with Clojure at the time. And I wrote some test code with Clojure. I don't know that it was fully appreciated at the time, doing that. But in my spare time, I started up a series of blog posts about porting on Lisp to Clojure. And so my first blog post, I did this funny thing. I think it's kind of funny. I thought, I can't change any values. I don't know how to change values. Right. So what I did is if you see in the code, hopefully you can see the code, is I created a one-element array with a 0 in the array. And so I closed over that, and then the counter, I just modified that one little piece.
Immutable cell there.
Yeah, and and I thought I was being clever, right?
Yeah.
And some guy named Chris Hauser was the first person to ever comment on that blog post. And he said, I think it's really cool that what you did there, but that's not how you do it in Clojure. I thought, wow, there's this Clojure expert who's explaining to me how this is done. I think that's so cool.
And being 2008, that means I had been aware of Clojure for probably like 2 weeks and was ready to dispense advice.
Ready to dole out advice.
That's right. Oh, so yes, I wanted to talk about this. This is around the same time that I actually contributed something to Clojure that I'm still proud of, and that is the regex literal syntax. So you can see there on the left the way it was at the time, and after collecting input from the community and advocating for a position and posting patches and rationale and all those things, we had this major shift over to what you see on the right.
So at the time, when you say got feedback from the community, this is all done.
This is the mailing list.
This is the mailing list, right?
And
you were conversing with dozens of people?
Oh, well, I don't know. There was maybe hundreds.
Hundreds?
I mean, so I think there were fewer people that were using it that were inactive in the context, right? Almost anybody that was using Clojure, I think, was probably conversing on the mailing list. So, yeah, but Well, I'm glad you appreciate it as well. It doesn't look big on this slide, but I think that's a lot of slashes if you don't do that. So, and I think it's also interesting because the amount of there was on the thread of people actually communicating on this particular topic. There probably was half dozen people, but it's not a short thread. It was a substantial amount of discussion, spanning in total multiple months. And of course, the changes, I don't know, it's like a 3-line change to the code. But you have to be careful about these breaking changes, right?
That's right.
So.
That's right. Speaking of breaking changes, one of the little syntax pieces that I'm personally responsible for is the use of hyphen, dot hyphen to access.
The fields.
The fields.
Yeah.
And so that, interestingly enough, that may be the first time that. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but that's the first time that Clojure script was influential on Clojure. We can get to that when we get there.
Okay. 2009, hair. Okay, so this is the Clojure 1.0, 2009, and so I have a graph here, and there's 2 triangles, one sort of in the middle and one on the right that you can see there. The one in the middle is for the initial release, and then the one on the right represents 1.0. So there was actually several releases in between there, but they were all pre-1.0, so I didn't try to list them all. And I don't know, I tried to just show sort of the growth of the language, and so most of those lines are stacked lines of code. So you can see on the very left, the yellow and blue together are the Java and C#. And then right before the first release, you can see that the C# disappears, and even the Java is trimmed back some. But just a matter of weeks, a week or two before that first triangle, you can see the green line starting to come up. Those are the number of vars, or var-like symbol things. And that of course, has a different scale there on the right of the graph. But it's interesting to me that it really was just a week or two before the first release that the first .clj file showed up in the repo and got those first 100 or so symbols. But then over the next, that next year, it's growing quite a bit in number of symbols and lines of code. And by the time 1.0 came out, it was already 450 vars in the namespace. So just the breadth, the seriousness of the language was starting to really settle in.
Those are furious times.
There was a lot going on, a lot of changes. This is the span where all these renames are happening and fundamental things like multi-method showing up, and so it was exciting times to be paying attention to the language.
That's right.
And I have a little note here. It was just a couple months after that 1.0 release that the words Clojure conj, referring to a conference, showed up in the IRC logs. So it was still another, I guess, year before the conference actually happened, but people started talking about it. And I don't know if it's ever been called anything other than the conj. So
it's so natural.
It is.
Yeah. So skipping ahead to 2010, it was, speaking of the conj, this is the year that the conj happened.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so, interestingly enough, for me,
no, it's interesting.
I happen to have given the first talk ever at a Clojure conj.
So you opened the conference?
I opened the conference.
Wow.
And it wasn't the first talk that I had ever given, but it was my first Clojure talk. And to give a talk about a language when the language creator is in the audience, it tends to be a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And I distinctly remember at the time that I was so nervous that I spoke probably 1.75 times faster than I should have, and the talk was over in 18 minutes.
It was a good one, though. You should go back. Have you gone back to look at it?
Just scale back the speed a little bit.
Yeah, you can do it right on YouTube. And yeah. 2011, the year of ClojureScript.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine now that ClojureScript has been around since 2011.
Yeah.
I distinctly remember when we first started talking about it at Relevance at the time, and we were discussing, Rich was discussing about what the goals could be for this thing, and who should we bring in to help with this thing, and I know at the time that everyone was in favor of having yourself come in. You were not an employee of Relevance.
Right.
You came in and joined us on these weekly calls.
Yeah.
Do you remember the weekly?
That was an interesting process to be. It was run like almost like an agile team, right? Like a weekly stand up, and
right.
But there was a few of us from outside the company that got to join.
Yourself, and I think Chaz was involved, and David Nolan.
Devin, a couple people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, if you look at the commit logs for ClojureScript, we're still there. We're still sort of number 5 and number 7.
That's good.
But all of that stuff is sort of front-loaded, right?
Yeah.
This is when Clojure, the compiler, was maybe 1,000 lines.
That's right. I think Rich likes to joke that it was small and tidy, and then he handed it to us,
Yes.
and we messed it up. But yeah.
But it was a lot of fun, and we did a lot of cool things early on. But
Yeah.
I think really the turning point for ClojureScript came a little bit later on in that year with this commit, and this is
David Nolan.
David Nolan's first commit to ClojureScript, and I think it's, maybe it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that coming on to ClojureScript is probably the most important thing that ever happened.
Absolutely. I mean, look at that for a first commit. Oh, we'll just add reify.
Yeah. Let me show you how it's done. Here's reify.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how David has shepherded that, and not only David, right? I mean, he's had help from others as well. I mean, Antonio gave a talk yesterday.
Yep.
Very important contributor to ClojureScript.
Yeah, and starting then, but yeah, for the next several years, ClojureScript grew and changed in many dramatic ways. We don't have a whole lot of details in this talk, but Antonio did give a good overview of the last few years in his 2012 hair.
2012 hair.
So, at this point, the language is not growing in size quite so rapidly, but there are still interesting and important things happening. So we'll sort of go through some of these releases. Reader literals, so even, I don't know if anybody else has this perspective, but at least for me, at this point, a lot of these features seem recent to me.
They do. They feel recent.
And but they're not, right? So reader literals have been there for 5 years now. So
The
and there's a dash prefix.
Yeah. So I had mentioned that now this is really the first time that ClojureScript informed Clojure.
Right.
And the reason was because in JavaScript, there's what you can hold in an objects field can be a function, or it can be a value, and so you can never really tell. So that you have to have.
When you refer to it, do you want the function that's sitting there, or do you want to
function,
invoke
or do you
it?
want the value.
Yeah.
And so we devised this little syntax that allows you to say, I want the property.
Yeah.
I want to pull out the property.
And that was critical for ClojureScript.
Yeah.
Not critical for Clojure.
That's right.
But in order
it
to
made its
unify
way
the
in.
language. Yeah.
That's right.
So that's great.
And I don't recall anyone ever complaining that it broke them, but it had the potential to break people.
Yeah, it did. It's in the release notes as a breaking change, so that before that, I suppose technically you could refer to a Java field with, I guess, a dash in the beginning of the name. I don't even know if you can make such a function.
I guess. Rich is shaking his head, so that's a no.
It was listed as a breaking change, though, so yeah, you got to be careful because. Was it? The Clojure implementation was buggy. In 1.6. That's okay. It's all still in the slides, so that's all in the past. It's fixed now. That's all we need to know.
You can probably blame me for that bug.
Reducers. So this is a year later, 2013. 1.5 reducers. The new threading macros. That's the arrow sum and arrow when, and I guess it's not called sum now, right? So yeah, I even have the old name for that one in my head because these are so recent. These changes. Clojure 1.6, interop for Java programs calling into Clojure. Namespaced keywords. So here you can see more sort of cross
outside influence?
Yeah,
maybe?
outside influence going around, because that's a thing that's most important for datomic, or at least if not influence in the syntax, just the thought processes that are going on. It's almost as if the same person was thinking about all these things at the same time. Yeah. I didn't know till I was making these slides that if some is a thing. Did you know that?
I'm not sure that I knew.
Do people use if some? That's great.
Rich likes people to raise their hand, so raise your hand if you've used if some. I shouldn't raise
That's
my hand.
great.
I haven't used it.
No. I'm sure I'll use it now that I know about it. Transducers. This is 1.7, 2015. We're getting a little closer to modern times here. And reader conditionals. So again, more Clojure script influenced synergy, I guess, right? Where you can now not only is it possible to write code that works in both languages, but you can starting to be serious tooling support for that. .8 and direct linking. So I guess the Clojure core itself is direct linked, right? I don't know if people raise your hand. Does anybody use direct linking outside of Clojure core itself? There's a couple. That's great for performance, right? That's the main purpose. So that's great. One of those maybe infrequently used features that's important for certain contexts.
The socket REPL, I think that I don't see a lot of people using that either. Although I think that it's somewhat of an important step in that prior to that, the way that people could communicate, via their tools is to sort of call out to this server, this middleware and now this is sort of bringing the idea of having this interactive REPL environment, in process.
Yeah. So I guess without having to either provide your own middleware, like you said, or be in charge of launching the process. So I'm sure we'll see more tooling support around that. Okay, so this is that same graph as before, but up through well, not today, but a few weeks ago when I made the graph. So you can see more triangles as there's more releases. Lines of code is growing, number of vars is growing. We're up to the 600s now of vars. It's not, we were talking about this yesterday, that those of us that were around in the 1.0 era think of Clojure as a small language. And it is, but it's not as small as we think anymore. It's quite a bit bigger.
I think it's somewhat interesting that between this 2008 area and 2000, just before the mid 2009, I suppose, it's really the number of vars just shot up.
Yeah.
From 121 to 458. Those are exciting times.
A lot was going on, and since then, not as much rapid growth, right?
So would you say the Clojure is dying?
Well, no. So here's the thing: if you want to look at just the language itself, right? You can look at it in a perspective that does. But I made another graph. And there's a lot of Clojure code out there, but even just the officially supported, or not even officially supported, but the code that's hosted on the GitHub.com organization, right? So there's lots of important libraries, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But just the ones that are on the GitHub, you can see that that's almost linear. You can see, actually, it's kind of interesting to me that there's, while the language was still changing rapidly, the contrib and other libraries have not taken off yet. But right around the time, 2009, when that's starting to taper off, the community support for just reach into other domains shoots up. And so you can see the green layer there is Clojure script starting to layer on top. You can see the C#, well, the C# was at the beginning, it dropped off, but Clojure CLR is the band at the very top, showing up and growing steadily through this time. Typed Clojure and all the rest of contrib. So there's a lot of activity in the community, and running through the whole thing at that bottom blue layer is the language itself there, changing, but not growing rapidly. And so I think it depends on how you look at it. If these days we're working on, I'm working on a team that's building large pieces of Clojure code built on top of this same foundation. And I, for one, am pretty happy that the language is not changing quite as rapidly as it was in the pre-1.0 days. So
I agree. Yeah.
I think it depends on your perspective,
I think so.
which parts you choose to look at.
So what, in this time, 10 years later, we can take a moment to reflect back about the things that we thought we were getting when we first came into Clojure and discovered it. And now, 10 years later, what did we actually get?
Yeah.
And so when we first started exploring Clojure, we thought we were getting a hobby language.
Yeah.
And so that's what I used it for, and that's the way I viewed it. But now, 10 years later, what I actually got was a language that I can base a career on.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I think it happened before now, but Clojure, I think, recently or crossed a threshold where there are people in this room that can spend the rest of their career writing Clojure code.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. But before I started learning Clojure, I had learned new languages and sort of jumped from one to the next every couple of years, and assumed the same thing would happen with Clojure, that I would learn the lessons and move on. But I'm still learning things, and
we just found if some.
That's right.
So back then, I recall that there was a so it was a video or.
Yeah, I couldn't remember. I have images in my head of seeing Rich talking about a 600 core machine, but I couldn't find any video. So maybe, but there's a little chat on IRC of I think it was at a Java 1 conference maybe, where Cliff Click had these Azul machines with 600 cores, and how pleased Rich was to run some kind of, I don't know if it was the Ants demo or a different one that was driving all 600 CPUs to 100% and making good use of the machine.
And at the time, I really wanted one.
Yeah, of course. And we knew, we had the Intel timelines, and these massively multi-core machines were coming. And so what do we have now? As soon as they show up,
I still want one though. I still want one.
I guess a 4-core machine in my pocket is no, not really.
It'll have to do for now.
It'll have to do. But we're ready. Clojure's ready to go as soon as we have all 600 cores.
So I had mentioned that I wanted to use Clojure. When I really started thinking about how to use it, I wanted to use it because of its access to Java libraries. We had written just a mountain of code, Java code.
Yeah.
Probably 1 million lines of code that we were maintaining, and so
to test that and leverage that using.
To test that, I wanted to use Clojure in that way, and so finally taking that step to use it for real, beyond a hobby context. That's what I thought. This is where I thought it would end, right? This is a tool for testing. I can do it quickly. I can do it interactively. But interestingly enough,
lots of Clojure libs now as well. So we still have. I mean, we're seeing talks during this conference of people still leveraging new Java libs from Clojure, but we have a lot of libraries of our own now. So I went to the Clojure Toolbox website, and this isn't all of them, and there are no repeats on this slide. So there's a lot of activity in the Clojure library ecosystem. So many categories and so many options in each category to choose from. And at the beginning, when we didn't even have support for loading in files from, loading in code from a namespaced file or anything like that, to imagine that we would have this much of our own code in our own community is stunning to realize. So.
Yeah. So, what did we think we were getting? Well, in the beginning, it was a warm and welcoming language. And I think that a lot of that had to do with the fact that very early on, Rich sort of set the tone for the way the language, the way to interact with each other.
We didn't talk about this before, but I think this is a good time to mention that I do have logs for the IRC, and they're online. You can look for them. from the time that I joined the channel, because that's when I started keeping the logs. And if you go back to that first day, you can see me showing up saying, like, I think my program ran, but I'm not sure. I couldn't tell if it finished or not. And Rich is in the room, you know, right there, and I didn't realize he was the creator, but it was friendly and welcoming, and it was great.
And something really stands out to me from that time, and there were many discussions, and sometimes they would get heated, but there was always a respectful tone. But there was one discussion, I think it was between Chaz Emmerich and Rich, that got a little heated and maybe went in a direction that Rich was uncomfortable with. And it was the first or second conj. Before Rich gave his talk, he took a moment and apologized publicly to Chaz. I thought, I had never seen anything like that before.
Yeah, I think it's important because we all, you know, we do make mistakes, and if you choose to ignore it or defend yourself or whatever, it's impossible to heal from those situations, right? And it would have been entirely easy to either ignore it and move on, or to apologize personally, which would have been, I'm sure, sufficient. But Rich took the, you know, personally risky choice to stand up, as physical a representation of this community as you can get, and call it out and address it directly.
Yeah. And that's an embodiment, I think, of the way that the community has gone. And it's a community that is trying to get better.
Yeah.
And it
continues to work on it.
Continues to work on
yeah,
it. Identifies that sometimes there are issues that we need to work on. And so I'm proud to be a part of that.
Yeah, me too.
So back then we thought we were getting some great concurrency primitives.
Yeah.
And we did. I mean, they were there, right?
Yeah.
Software transactional memory.
Yeah, I use refs all the time.
Yeah, me too.
Do you?
Me too.
No.
Actually, I've never used that. So, aside from code examples in the book,
right.
I think I saw Stuart Sierra use it once.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the only time.
Yeah. So it's good they're there, but maybe when the 600 core machines show up,
yes.
maybe we'll need them then. I don't know.
That's what I've been waiting for.
That's right.
Agents, yeah. I use it no more.
Okay, well, a little bit.
A little bit more,
A
yeah,
little bit
sure.
more. But it's not like the dominant mechanism in our code bases, right?
That's right. But
So,
there we go.
Atoms.
That's really what we needed.
That's
what we needed all along.
The super powerful concurrency primitive
Yes.
of atoms.
Atoms, they're
That's
pretty
what-
useful. I'd
Oh
say.
yeah, I use them all the time. Yeah.
So finally, in this sort of retrospective, we thought eventually, once we moved past this hobby, the view of it as a hobby language, thought, okay, it's a programming tool. It's something I can use in my tests. But really, I think that it became a lot more than that. And for me, Clojure became a lens. And I've said this in a couple of talks, but it's a lens for viewing how to construct programs, how to design systems, how to architect systems.
Yeah, I think the thing for me that was really has really changed my thinking because of Clojure is the separation of the parts of object-oriented programming. At the time, I was pretty proud of my own abilities to use object-oriented principles to design solutions. But it wasn't until the mechanisms in Clojure allowed me to see how you can separate inheritance from multi-method dispatch, and separate that from data. How your data doesn't have to live in your code in order to have inheritance. Those kinds of things, and that ability to think about it in those pieces extends way beyond just the programming problems, but into large-level system design, where they maybe even have a more positive impact, thinking about where you keep your data versus where you keep your code, and where the code executes, and how those things can be separated. So that's been hugely influential in lots of systems designs that I've had to impact on.
So instead of a programming tool, maybe it's safe to say that the discovery of Clojure was transformational.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about the next 10 years? Well, Rich has given us this tool, and it's a tool that we can use to create the systems and even the language that we want. So we don't have to wait for Rich if we want to do something. it's there, and we can leverage it.
So yeah,
That's
next 10 years are up to you.
It's up to you. That's all we have. Thank you.